Welcome to the Automation World Get Your Questions Answered podcast. I'm David Greenfield, Editor-in-Chief at Automation World, and in this episode, we're speaking with Robert Schoenberger, Editor-in-Chief at Industry Week, which focuses on manufacturing industry news. So thanks for joining me, Robert.
Oh, happy to be here, David.
So, Robert, before we get started, I just wanted to let our listeners know why I'm speaking with you for this podcast, since we usually feature automation and manufacturing industry professionals. And the reason for this is that I wanted to go beyond our usual automation technology-specific insights and take a look at the manufacturing industry's current business trends and how that may or may not affect automation decisions in the near term. So with that kind of grounding, let's, start right off the bat with, one of the biggest issues facing industry today. And that is, what are you hearing from manufacturers with regard to things like fluctuating demand, supply chain challenges, and tariffs, or other issues that you're hearing that you think will have the most impact on the adoption of automation technologies in 2025?
The biggest factor is going to be workforce, and that has been the driver for automation for a very long time, but it's just getting worse and worse and worse every year. There's so much competition for a small pool of available employees right now. You have the boomers retiring in large numbers every day, and the generations behind them, the Gen X, the Gen Z, the Gen Alphas, they're just not large enough. There are not enough people to replace all of those highly skilled, experienced workers, and automation is filling that gap. And we're just hearing that constantly. And some of the newer trends in robotics, especially, are feeding that. Some of the cobots and some of the smaller robots are smaller. They're less expensive. They're easier to install. You're seeing these as a service models. All these other sorts of issues popping up that are making robots a possibility for smaller and mid-sized companies instead of just the large automakers or the large electronics companies and people like that who've had access to these technologies in the past. So tariffs, that's going to pose an issue, but it's hard to say if that's going to boost or depress automation use. Fluctuating demand is a constant issue, but no more so than a few years ago. But the workforce issue, that's just absolutely reaching a crisis for just about every manufacturer out there right now.
So it sounds like, just to kind of recap and make sure we're on the same page, that obviously the workforce issues is the biggest one that industry's been grappling with for years. But when it comes to supply chain, that seems to be the ongoing issues we've been dealing with. Nothing particularly new there. And the tariffs are still, at this point in mid-January, as we're recording this, is still kind of a wait and see what actually really comes to pass.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of that wait and see attitude towards the tariffs because it's not clear what's going to happen, and if so, what's the best reaction. If we do see across the board tariffs, and there is a huge incentive to start building production back in the United States, those are going to be automated facilities, highly automated facilities, because we still have higher labor costs than some of the low-cost Asian countries that we would be moving production from. So that would imply a good time for robotics. But until we see the shape and size of the tariffs, the general advice people have been giving so far is wait and see. Don't overreact. Don't jump into a massive new investment until you understand exactly how these policy changes are going to affect your operations.
Yeah, that, and then of course, even once those decisions are made, depending on what does or doesn't happen, it's still going to be years, as that gets actually implemented and anything actually comes to light and is actually in place. So, based on all this, are there certain automation technology types that you think, I know you've mentioned robots and cobots, of course, but those or others that you think will be of highest interest to manufacturers this year?
Yeah, I think if you look at who's spending on robots and who's spending on automation right now and who isn't, the automotive industry is spending less and less every year on robotics and installed automation systems. And that you could see that as, they're pulling back on things. It's really a more complex story than that. That's the largest user of automation systems by a huge margin. But one, they've made these investments over a very long period of time, and they have highly automated facilities. So there's not a lot of room to grow. So there's not a lot. Yeah, the automotive market's more of a replacement market now for a lot of the automation technologies. But then there's also the continued trend that's been going on for many, many years now to outsource as much as possible to the supply chain. And so we're seeing that there's actually been a very strong increase in installations of robotics, specifically at metal and machinery industry operations. So the people who are making parts for the automakers are buying a lot of the robots that maybe the Fords and GMs and Toyotas of the world would have been buying a few years ago. So it's just moving down the chain. And one of the reasons of that is just the lower cost. Cobots are a big part of the lower cost, but not the entirety of it. You can get a 6-axis Fanuc or an ABB for a tenth the price you would have, a decade ago. So the cost per robot, especially for these large industrial ones, is so much more approachable now to some of these mid-sized manufacturers than it was a while back. That said, the ones getting the most attention right now are smaller, lighter, again, collaborative. Going back to the whole workforce issue, finding a skilled robotics engineer, someone who can program the systems and set those things up, that's a lot more challenging than telling someone, okay, actually guide the robot to do what you want it to do, and then we'll use some simplified programming after the fact. It's a lot easier to set things up now than it used to be, and you don't necessarily need the highly trained engineer for every project. I mean, obviously, when you're doing one of these really complex operations with 25 processes and things like that, that's one thing. But if you're, I've seen some applications recently where kind of end of the line, grabbing the things off, palleting them up, and wrapping them. You don't need complex robotic skills and programming skills to do something like that. But that is the sort of thing that allows you to save one more person in the warehouse, and those get very, 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 very tough jobs to fill right now.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned those kind of spot solutions, if you will, for robotics, and that I've been seeing much more of that in the past several years for that instead of this large complex integration, which obviously happens, where people are redoing lines or obviously in greenfield plant situations, but have been seeing a lot of that for like these isolated spot cases of it, which are much simpler to implement. Absolutely. So on the flip side of that, are you hearing anything from manufacturing businesses that make you think certain kinds of automation tech investments, whether it's software or hardware, might be put on the back burner this year compared to where interest has been over the past few years?
Yeah, I'm actually fairly optimistic for 2025, just because the past 18 months or so have major industry has been in this weird limbo spot. It's just the worst possible scenario for big investments in technology, which was orders were coming in at a fine pace. They weren't exciting. It was not the sense of, oh my God, things are awful. We need to lay off half of our workers and cut costs to survive. But also it wasn't, oh wow, we can't hit demand, so we need to invest dramatically to meet these orders. Things were coming in fine, and fine is just not a good place to be if you're trying to justify big capital expenses. And that really defined almost all of 2024 and the latter half of 2023. Inflation, went up. People were kind of panicking a bit, but the consumer spending stayed strong. So you had just this very weird leveling effect where there was lots and lots of concern, but no real long-term damage being done to a lot of these industries. So you just saw people kind of waiting it out and waiting it out and waiting it out. We have a lot of factors going into 2025 now that imply that this is going to be a better year. One, housing starts have really taken off, and housing starts ripple through the economy into every manufacturing trend. Because, okay, a new house needs a new dishwasher, a new refrigerator, all these. So the more houses you build, the more economic activity that really floods the manufacturing sector between automotive appliances, electrical distribution systems, all these things. And we're seeing some really positive signs on housing starts and a lot of the policy discussions happening. This was Biden or Trump where we're going to do this. We know there's a housing crisis in America where we have too few houses for too many people. So that this was going to have to happen. And so that alone seems like it's going to really drive, especially toward the latter half of the year, a lot of production in a lot of industries, which will mandate investments in automation to meet that rising tide. So I don't see any one technology that's kind of passe at this point. I mean, I do see more of it going into the easier to install, faster ROI, smaller robots, just because that's what people are going to want. They're going to want something that can, quickly see that return on. The bigger projects, the green fields, we're going to pull out the entire line and start over from scratch and come out with the best possible, highly orchestrated facility. I don't see that as popular these days. That was always a big automotive thing, and that really is back in the days where you could sell 500,000 Toyota Camrys a year. Now that the market is so stratified and everyone wants a slightly different vehicle, you don't see one product dominating the markets enough that you can justify these like single purpose robots that do just one thing, or single purpose automation assemblies that just do one or two things. Everything has to be more flexible. Everything has to be a little bit slower. And that kind of points to things like highly programmable robots, so slower, more capable, not necessarily that, feed top line production, fast, like we saw a few years ago.
Yep, exactly. We've been seeing that a lot, particularly in the food packaging industry. Been seeing a lot of new starts in that area and applications in that area as well, outside of the typical automotive, aerospace, and electronics industries. It's, had been for decades, have been kind of the harbingers of, automation of, both hardware and software.
You mentioned food and bev. Last year, I had a chance to tour the Miller brewing facility up in Milwaukee, and it's fascinating there because you think of that. Well, they're making Miller beer. Well, they're not. They're making 50 different brands of beer, and the packaging, the sizes of the cans are different depending on which line, and the boxing, the shipment, all that. That is a highly automated facility, but it's also very, very, very flexible because it's not making one thing. It's making 50 different products on the same lines very, very quickly. I mean, the brewing process is very focused on one thing, but outside of that, the complexity of a lot of these food and dev operations is just amazing these days.
Absolutely. So, going back, I wanted to touch on the workforce issues again that you mentioned earlier. As we discussed, that's long been a major factor for manufacturers of all sizes, and it's just getting worse. But how do you see automation technologies specifically influencing strategies for manufacturers around these workforce issues, such as reskilling programs or training and support for changes in job roles? Are you hearing much about that?
Yeah, there are a lot of states and communities are trying to tackle that, trying to. Someone made a really good point to me back at the beginning of COVID that the first companies that really figure out how to convince a fry cook to come over and work in a manufacturing plant are going to be the ones that are going to have the workforce of the future, because restaurants have typically hired unskilled labor and trained them to do what they need to do. But it's a miserable job. And I don't mean that, I'm not denigrating anyone who works food service, but it's long hours, it's nights and weekends. It's not a set schedule where a manufacturing plant can offer you a 9 to 5, or maybe it's a 7 to 3. But you're getting a standard daily shift. You have a lot more predictability in your work. There's the opportunity for overtime. So there are a lot of advantages it can offer, but it's always struggled. The manufacturing industry has always struggled to find the people that food service has been able to grab. So when you start talking about strategies that people are using, there are some efforts out there, especially at the state level, to train people on some of these technologies. But I think the bigger issue is just going to be on the planning side, as companies are looking at they need to boost productivity 10%. How can they do that? Can they hire 10% more people? If not, can we hire 5% more people and then add which lines have the least value add? Where are we putting people right now that we could put a simplified automation solution? If we can't afford to hire a person for $35,000-$40,000 a year, can we justify a robots as a service to come in to, again, do that end of line packaging? And so I'm seeing a lot of interest in that. Very strategic, one-on-one, one-to-one replacements. How can I maximize the actual people I can find, and then use technology to fill the gaps?
And we'll see how this develops too. There's a lot of the discussion too that one of the jobs that should be increasing in industry are the people to maintain these various robotic technologies. That's creating potentials for new jobs and new skills.
And those will be highly, highly skilled jobs, those maintenance jobs. Tom Wilk from our partner brand Plant Services and I have talked about this quite a few times. They really focus on that asset management, maintaining your systems and all that. And boy, maintenance engineers are, worth their weight in gold these days. It is really tough to find someone who can come in, understand these machines, and make sure that they are doing everything they can do. And then that's why we're also seeing, on top of where people are spending money, predictive maintenance. These Bluetooth sensors you can attach to a robot, or you can attach to a conveyor belt, or you can attach to various pieces of equipment to report back on vibration and heat analysis to understand when a bearing is going bad and how you can replace things before the line goes down. Huge interest in that. And it's hard to account for that, because how do you prove that you saved money if the machine didn't explode?
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's always the catch when nothing does happen. See, we didn't need that, right?
Exactly,
But that's why it didn't explode. Yeah.
But we're seeing some really good numbers coming out of people who have invested in these systems, that they're tracking their spend. And yes, their total spend on maintenance goes down the more information they get early into the system and really attack those things. But so that's going to be I expect that to really, really pick up as we add more robotics, as we add more automation. We're going to see more and more interest in these technologies that will really maximize the uptime of them.
So shifting gears a little bit from workforce and over to sustainability, that's another issue that's been ongoing for manufacturers for decades now, particularly in certain industries, the highly regulated ones. Are you hearing anything specifically from your manufacturing industry readers from the business aspect of that about sustainability that might have an impact on their automation choices?
Yeah, mostly that seems to be, it all depends on your exposure to Europe. We do have sustainability pledges and regulations and things pushing in the US, but they're not, a lot of those were kind of voluntary pledges that companies were making at a time when there was more of a political push to show how sustainable you are. And there were some regulatory things about you had to report how sustainable things were, but that really didn't. There's been a pushback against that. Changing administrations, I expect a lot of those requirements to drop off. Automotive, clearly they have very aggressive fuel economy targets to hit. A lot of those are baked into the system right now, but the new Trump administration will try to reduce the impact of some of that. Power plants are facing some very tough upcoming regulations, but again, that becomes how quickly will the regulatory changes in Washington roll down to that. Companies with a strong exposure to Europe, they generally have global requirements they have to meet, and I haven't heard a lot relating to automation on that side. Are they using automation as a strategy to meet some of those goals? I hear more of that is trying to reduce energy use, things like that. So, I mean, you don't see too many hydraulics or pneumatics left in plants these days. Almost everything is electrically actuated, so you can better control and lower the amount of force being used in a lot of these tools. No, I haven't heard a lot of how automation is playing into that market. I'm sure it is playing a role, but with with lots of expected changes coming on that side of things, I just don't see that being the driver.
And that's mostly historically that's been in the sensors and software side of automation and sustainability anyways. But yeah, like I said, it's, kind of like the tariffs at this point. It's a wait and see what actually comes to pass that may or may not have impacts on it. So one last question for you, Robert, kind of where the rubber hits the road in these sorts of decisions, when it comes to CapEx. How are you seeing that looking for manufacturers this year? And again, based on what you're hearing, what type of impact do you think that might have on any kind of specific automation purchasing decisions?
So I'm going to give a little bit of a plug here to one of my colleagues here at the Lombard is an editor at large at Endeavor Business Media. He contributes to a lot of different brands. I think he's done some work for you guys, but he does a lot of work for Industry Week and for Fleet Owner and some other publications within our company. And he does a quarterly report where he'll pour through all of the things said in earnings calls from the largest publicly traded manufacturing companies, looking for what they're saying about very specific topics, and he rates them on a scale. And the interest in capital expenditure has gone up considerably over the last 2 quarters. Really going into the fourth quarter, the optimism in the C-suite has gone up very, very noticeably. This sense of we've gotten past the doldrums of 2023, 2024. We're ready for something big and new to happen. That said, people spoke very positively at the end of 2023 going into 24, and none of that growth happened. So I think, like I said earlier, I think there is some excitement building, and I do hear companies talking more about the need for upgrading facilities and things like this. But I'll believe it when I see it actually being spent instead of being discussed.
Like you said, after last year, especially, we kind of thought things were going to turn in 2024, and it didn't really quite develop that way. This is, as we've said a few times, it's kind of a wait and see sort of situation.
Just on the big picture, there was this talk really throughout 23 and 24 about how much manufacturing spending had increased on facilities. It was the largest increase in manufacturing capex in a generation. It's a true statement, but it was also very, very limited to 2 sectors. Electric vehicle battery production and semiconductors. You had the CHIPS Act passed, so you had Intel, Micron, and a handful of other companies, each spending hundreds of billions of dollars to get these plants built. So that completely skewed the capex market. If you took out the battery producers and the semiconductor companies, there was a mild growth for the rest of the manufacturing sector, nothing unusual. But those federally subsidized microchips and car batteries, that's where all the growth was. So what I'm hearing now is much more broad-based. We're hearing from, industrial equipment companies, the Illinois Tool Works and the Cummins, or the people like that who are producing some of the parts that go into the things that feed the manufacturing machine, and they're showing more optimism now than they did a year ago. So.
Well, hey, thank you for joining me for this podcast, Robert. And thanks, of course, to all of our listeners. And remember to keep watching the space to stay on top of the latest news, trends, and insights on the world of industrial automation.